In the months leading up to the momentous D-Day invasion of June 1944, it was the pivotal responsibility of the United States 8th Air Force to gain air supremacy over the German Luftwaffe, to disrupt the enemy's ability to effectively deploy ground forces throughout occupied France in support of their Normandy defenses, and to cripple the German aircraft manufacturing industry. Without accomplishing these critical objectives, Allied leaders feared for the success of the planned invasion. Beginning on February 20th, 1944, the mighty 8th Air Force launched the largest aerial assault ever on the German homeland. In what was to become known as the Big Week, the mighty 8th put up over 1,000 B-17 and B-24 bombers and over 800 fighters. Along with 16 squadrons of U.S. Mustangs and British Spitfires, they inflicted major damage to the Nazis' war machine. In the ensuing months, the 8th Air Force, along with other U.S. and British units, brought aerial devastation throughout the German homeland and to the Reich capital itself, Berlin. On D-Day, June 6th, the 8th Air Force flew over 2,300 sorties along the Normandy coast, all aimed at neutralizing enemy coastal defenses and frontline troops. Following the end of hostilities in Europe, the mighty 8th moved to the Pacific Theater and continued to evolve its mission and aircraft, contributing to the ultimate victory over the Japanese in July 1945. By war's end, they suffered more than 26,000 combat deaths. Many 8th Army Air Corps flight crews were missing in action and never accounted for. To honor these losses and to tell the story of the mighty 8th, Major General Lewis E. Lyle, United States Air Force, a B-17 bomber pilot and veteran of over 70 bomber missions during World War II, and other veterans, began planning a museum. Conceived of in 1983, the vision finally became a reality on May 14, 1996, with the dedication of the National Museum of the mighty 8th Air Force. Situated on 13 acres in Pooler, Georgia, the museum tells the compelling story of the ordinary people whose lives were transformed by their extraordinary commitment, sacrifice, and patriotism.
Hello, I'm Arnold Rosen, Sun City resident, Korean War veterans, and your host for this special Sun City visit to the National Museum of the mighty 8th Air Force in Pooler, Georgia. With many military veterans from all services living nearby in Sun City Hilton Head, we are doubly proud to have this extraordinary facility nearby in the coastal empire. It serves both as a reminder of their past service and special recognition of the ongoing tangible contributions a number of them continue providing to the museum to this day. We are standing in the awesome expanse of the Lewis E. Lyle Rotunda with its soaring ceiling and imposing bronze statues in lasting tribute to 8th Air Force legends. Founded in Savannah, Georgia, only weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the 8th Air Force began with just 7 men and no airplanes. Less than a year later, it was charged with destroying German industrial capabilities. With flight crews flying 25,000 feet above the earth in oxygen-devoid air and at temperatures as low as 50 below zero, the 8th Air Force fought a war unlike anything experienced before or since. I'm here with Paul Grassi, World War II bomber pilot. How many missions did you fly as a World War II pilot?
I flew 13 missions.
And where did you take off from in England?
Took off from a town called Bungay. It was very near the English Channel, just near the Bay of Lowestoft.
Can you think back of one mission that stands out in your mind as kind of dangerous and challenging?
Combat is very interesting in that it happens fast. But I think that weather was another enemy we had. And one day that we had a huge problem was that it had been, there were storms all over Europe. And we had to take off a short runway. There were always 3 runways at all these air bases. One was 6,000 feet, the other 2 were around 4,500 feet. So we had to take off one of the 4,500 foot runways because of the wind and the weather. And it was pouring rain in England, and it was also pouring rain on the continent, thunderstorms. So we took off, and we were told that we were going to form, which was a challenge anyhow, near Paris. So we flew, hour and a half to near Paris. And as I let down, there was a whole, maybe 150 B-24s doing the usual oval, but there was no way that we could find our position. And they were having trouble with the G system was out, which was one of the navigational aids we had. There was no way we were going to get in formation. So I let down, and the rain was raining so hard, thunder and lightning, while the water was coming through the windshield. And everybody was straggling, because we'd get maybe 800,000 airplanes. So anyhow, I get down to treetops and flew, and all of a sudden I find I'm over water. And we figured out that we were over the Bay of Antwerp. They have barrage balloons with big cables down. We didn't hit any, right? So now I had to figure out how to get out of there. So I gutsed it, and we didn't hit anything. That's a little scary when you don't know what you're doing, right? Right. So we kept over the trees, over the English Channel. When I got back, I found out that a number of planes had drifted north over German-occupied Holland. A lot of things happen with just good luck.
Paul, tell me a little bit about the history of this museum.
Lou Lyle, Major General, this rotunda is named after Lou. Lou flew 76 missions between 1942 and 45. He was with the 303rd Bomb Group and a little bit with the 379th. He was a command pilot. He went all over the country to find a home for the Mighty Eighth Museum. And he decided to come to Savannah because he came here and he got a great welcome from Chatham County, and Chatham County gave us 100,000 square feet of property here. And incidentally, our neighbor, JCB, since then has given us another 7.5 acres. We have room to expand. But Lou wanted a memorial to the 8th Air Force. Lou Lyle really was a starter, but he went out and he recruited Buck Schuler, the Lieutenant General, and Buck was in charge of the Mighty 8th, of the 8th Air Force in Barksdale. He was there when we raided Baghdad and Desert Storm. And they put this thing together, and Lou Lyle would be mighty proud of what he's on. His legacy is here. But more than that, we've been able to bring through each year 100, 200,000 people. We're working on children. Our mission is to keep alive the history of the Mighty 8th Air Force.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks again
Arnold.
for your service. Contained within the museum, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, is the restoration of the original vintage World War II B-17 Flying Fortress. Like its namesake, the original city of Savannah, it is being reborn and lovingly restored by a group of dedicated volunteers some Sun City residents devoting thousands of hours to this Herculean task. Here, with the next part of the story, is Sun City's Susan Safranek.
During the first 13 years of operation here at the museum, there seemed to be something missing. Not for lack of artifacts, but from an emptiness of spirit, for lack of a symbolic aircraft that embodied the story of the mighty 8th. Then, on the 16th of December 2008, a long-awaited message was finally received. The museum had been approved to receive a B-17G Flying Fortress from the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. One of the most popular exhibits, the B-17, is still in the process of undergoing its complete restoration inside the museum's combat gallery. All volunteers working on the fabrication and restoration are area residents, several of whom are from our own Sun City Hilton Head. With me now is Jerry McLaughlin, B-17 project manager. Jerry, how did you get involved with this project?
I had been, after I retired, I'd been working upstairs in the archives as an archivist, and when they found out the airplane was coming to be delivered to us, the then chief of the museum came up to me and he said, "Didn't you do a lot of project management during your career?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Boy, have I got a project for you." Next thing I knew, I was driving up to Washington and came back with the airplane.
Who did you get the B-17 from?
The Smithsonian donated the airplane to the museum through the efforts of President Bush. He was here for a political event, and he knew that the B-17 was had such a history with the 8th Air Force. He said to the director of the museum, "Where's your B-17? He said, "Sir, we don't have one." And he turned around to one of his aides and said, "Get this man a B-17. And everybody said, yeah, okay. Well, we got a call 3 weeks later, and a week after that, I was up in Washington, and we were bringing the airplane back.
Wow. Since it was inoperable, how did you get it here?
Actually, it was operable. We took it apart. It had flown into Washington. We hired a crew of retired Navy chiefs, and they were all very aviation qualified. They went up there, disassembled the airplane, put it on 4 trailer trucks. We brought it back here, and then they reassembled it right here in the museum.
How did the museum make room for it?
When the museum was designed, it was actually designed to hold a B-17, which is 103 feet wide, in this very room. What happened was, as the Navy chiefs told us in very ardent terms, that the architect had not thought about designing how he would get a crane in here to lift the engines and the wings. And what made it particularly difficult was they had to bring the crane in first, then the airplane piece by piece, and maneuver the crane around and then get the crane out.
Oh,
it was quite a project, and they thought they could assemble it in 3 days. It took 6.
Why did you name it the City of Savannah?
The original airplane that left here, named the City of Savannah, was paid for by a bond drive in 1944 here in Savannah. They raised $500,000, and in those days it was $234,000 for a B-17 and $500,000 to train 10 men to fly in it. Mm-hmm. And so for the $500,000 that the people of Savannah had raised, they named the plane, and they found a crew that was coming here where the pilot was from Georgia. And they selected that crew, and they flew the airplane from Savannah over to Europe.
When the plane came, who reassembled it?
Well, the Navy chiefs were here. They put it back together again, and they have come and visited us several times since then with regards to, see it how their project worked.
Where do you get the spare parts for it?
eBay.
Really?
I know that people don't believe that, but we go to eBay, and then there is a whole subculture of people in the United States who are devoted to working on B-17s and other World War II aircraft, and everybody is pretty much in contact with each other, and we send out wish lists, and we get wish lists from other people, and a significant portion of what we do, most of it in fact, with regards to parts are trades rather than cash purchases.
How long is it going to take to complete this?
On December 4th, 2014, it will be the 70th anniversary of when the original city of Savannah left here. And no matter what happens, we're declaring victory on that day, and the airplane will be dedicated right here in the combat gallery of the Mighty Eighth.
Now, I know that this is not the original city of Savannah. The original city of Savannah was lost. But tell me the history of this B-17.
This airplane was built the week after the war ended in Europe. And it was eventually had 3 different careers. It was out in front of a school in North Dakota as a memorial. It spent 20 years flying around the world as a photo mapping airplane, and then 10 more years as a firebomber, and then spent 25 years sitting in the Smithsonian before it arrived here.
Well, you also told me that there was a little shady past that it had too. Would you like to tell us that?
The airplane was flown to North Dakota, sat in front of a school, and they had a gentleman show up and say that they had gotten the plane for $300.
Oh my.
And the gentleman showed up and said he'd give them $5,000 for the airplane. And the school board met and said, sounds like a good deal to us, and he left with the airplane. Of course, that was illegal because the $300 was a donation to the federal government for the federal government giving them the airplane. So they taxied the airplane out onto the street in front of the school. It took off, and the police were chasing it, got as far as Florida, and found out it had already been sold up into Canada to a company, Kenting Aviation, up in Canada, and then they just had to give up because they couldn't chase it across the border.
Now that you have it here, how have you found that it affects the veterans who flew it?
We have learned a great deal about the psychological effect of people that have experienced combat from having them visit the airplane. I'll give you one very specific example. When the airplane was here maybe 2 or 3 weeks, a man and a woman approached me about my age and said their dad was with them and that he had been a World War II B-17 pilot and that he was terminally ill. And they asked, could we get him in the airplane? And we said, of course. And a lot of policy and a lot of learning came out of that one visit. We lifted the gentleman into the airplane. 2 or 3 of the fellows were inside. They got him into the cockpit, and he broke down in tears, and it took a while for him to bring himself back. And when he did, he asked if we could get him out of the airplane. Of course, they got him out. And one of the most powerful experiences I've had, I mean, right now it gives me chills thinking about it, is we took the gentleman out of the airplane, and once again he started crying, and his son and his grandchildren took him over to the other side of the gallery, and his daughter came over to me and put her arms around me and said, nobody in the world could have done for my father what you just did. And like I said, it gives me chills. I mean, for somebody to say that. And so we were all overwhelmed, and they left, and we realized we hadn't even talked to them about who he was, what his name was. So we now have a policy when people come into the museum and say that they are a B-17 veteran or a B-24 veteran, an 8th Air Force veteran, we bring them into the airplane, we write down all of their information, take a picture, and one of the things that I have learned is that inevitably, every time I brought one of the veterans into the airplane, what happens is at some time, all of a sudden, they'll just stop. And what I've learned to say in my mind is that they're back in 1944 or 1943, and they just are zoned out for a little while, sometimes 2 minutes, sometimes longer, and all of a sudden they'll come out and say, okay, let's go. And sometimes they're upset, sometimes they're not, but every veteran that I've taken through the airplane returns to those days when he was 19 or 20 years old flying in a B-17. So we have learned a great deal about how to deal with veterans when they come back here and we take them in the airplane.
Now, we have other people who come to the museum to look at it, and I know that there are a lot of volunteers from our Sun City who come and work on this. Do you find that they have the same emotion in a different way?
Everybody has their own emotion to it. We have all the retired guys that are here, we were all the sons of World War II veterans. Our parents talked about the war always, and some of their sons and daughters have come in to work with us, and I think it's something that they inherited from Grandpa, maybe. And it is it's nobody has the same story of why they're doing this.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for what you did. We're going to speak to some of the Sun City volunteers, and we're going to see what they have to say. I noticed that you have posted a mission up there for all of you people who are working on this that says our mission is to make the city of Savannah the finest static B-17 display in the world.
Yep.
What interested you in, what whetted your interest in starting working on this plane?
Oh, I guess when I was very young, I used to like to make model planes. And, you know, I just kind of grew from there. As I got older, I go to air shows. And I always wanted to work on one. And had the chance when I moved to Hilton Head and they got the plane here, that I was able to volunteer.
Did you have any prior experience in this field at all?
None at all.
What did you do before?
I used to work at the with the government in Washington for 40 years.
For 40 years. Now, you spend an awful lot of time here.
That's true.
What keeps you working on it?
It's a mission of love, really. You see the guys that come here that used to fly them, and it gets to you sometimes. But you're doing it to honor them in reality.
Now, you have a specialization here, as many of you do. You're a woodworker.
Yes.
Can you show us some of the things that you fabricated?
Mainly, I've been the kind of the expert on the wooden ammo boxes. There are 10 positions in the plane, and 3 of them have wooden ammo boxes. The nose has cheek boxes, which is here's an example. The waist has a couple of boxes, and the tail has a couple more. And they're all different sizes, and we use plans that we've gotten from Boeing, the original manufacturer. So these are as close to the originals as we can make them.
Can we lift this up and show everybody?
They're kind of in here. You can see on the end here. These are all inert, so there's no powder in them. So there's no danger at all, these, but it's just an example of what they would look like if you were to be going on a mission.
What else have you done here?
Done some work with the interior, the floors. Here's an example of some of the floor that'll be in the center section. Number of cases, display cases you see out by the plane I've built, and just general work around the plane.
Now, I understand that a preponderance of the stuff inside the plane is wood because it made it lighter. Is that?
Not really. Really, it's just the floors are the wood, and of course tables. Other than that, it's just thin aluminum.
Well,
No, nothing that's going to stop anything coming through it like flak or bullets or anything.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you
Okay.
for what you're doing. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have here Milt Stombler, another one of our volunteers from Sun City. Milt, what whetted your interest in this place?
Well, ever since I was a kid, there's been something magical about B-17s. I remember seeing pictures of these airplanes coming back from missions barely in one piece. And just something has always stayed with me about this airplane. And I was watching TV one day, and they were asking for volunteers to come here to restore B-17. So
Now, I know that you haven't had any experience in this field before. Tell us what you did before you came here.
I was in academia, a faculty member and a administrator in universities. And, but I've been a pilot for 48 years, so I have an interest in aviation.
Okay, all right. Now, as you've been working on this, what keeps you working on it?
It's just a joy. I don't know how else to describe it. I think it's the mission. It's getting this airplane to where it will honor the people who flew it, and it's working with an incredible group of guys that I never would have met before, who are incredibly skilled. I'm the gopher guy. I'm the least skilled guy in this group.
Well, I heard a story, something about polishing the plane.
Yes,
You want to share
yeah.
that with us?
Well, that's one of my tasks, is to keep the airplane clean. And of course, it gets rather dusty in here. And so I thought about what we might use, and I decided that we would just make a big dust cloth. Mm-hmm. And so we have a 20-foot long dust cloth, and we have one person in the front of the wing and one person in the back of the wing, and I'm on top of the wing, just going back and forth until we get to the end of the wing.
Some of the stuff that you're working on something that's a little bit smaller than a B-17.
Right.
Can you tell me about that?
Well, this is an oxygen regulator that each of the flight members wore. It clipped to their flight suit so they could walk around with an oxygen bottle like this. There are also oxygen regulators that you'll see fixed in the airplane as you go through the airplane. That's this type. And when we find them, and they're not easy to find, they look more like this. Actually, this one is better than most. And so,
Well-worn.
Well-worn. And so we tear them down, prime them, clean them, and repaint them. We don't worry about the inside. They're never going to have to work. They just have to look half decent. And that's a recent job that we've been doing. And there are just lots of jobs like this connected with the inside of the airplane. The inside of the airplane is now being done. The outside is mainly done. And it's a lot of detail work, having to put instruments back in and finding original World War II instruments, because this airplane flew in the 80s. And so it was flying with modern radios and modern instrumentation. That has to come out, and World War II type stuff has to go back in.
What a project.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you for what you're doing. I have Bud Curry, another of our Sun City volunteers, and I heard tell that he is a worker of miracles. He does all kinds of things and all kinds of restoration. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about what whetted your interest here. Why did you come?
I guess basically from a kid, airplanes has always been my main interest. And over the years, I've helped build three home builts, and we flew them all over the place and had my own airplane. So we'd come down here, retired, and come out to the museum, and you just get suckered in. It's just something that just mystique about this place. It just wants you to do it, and you go to the history of where these guys are. It's just fantastic.
That's wonderful. So you're really doing a busman's holiday, so to speak.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So
you had prior experience in the field of building your own and doing it. I think it's an interesting story about this. Now, will you tell us a little bit about this piece?
all right, this is the top part of the top turret, which we had the bar part. Another one fellow and I went up to Cleveland, Ohio, for the museum up there, and the curator at the museum found this as a planter up in Canada, and brought it down and donated it to here. So we went up and drove up and brought it back down. And as the state you sit in now is absolutely fantastic compared to what, it was nothing but a rust bucket. I mean, absolutely rust. Has put it all back together. So eventually it's going to get, a lot of hours have been put into this. It's absolutely fantastic what he's done with this. And
what do you have to do to fabricate something like that?
you just take that, makes the pieces, all these pieces all been redone, measure them, cut them out, weld them back in, body putty on them. It's a work,
Well,
lot of work.
I'm sure it's a lot of work.
A lot of hours put into that.
Yeah. Well, what keeps you coming back?
It's addictive here. I mean, the people, you have such a diversified workforce here of people from maintenance people to PhDs, and everybody has a common interest in getting this plane back on. And you meet and talk to some of the pilots who pilot these planes, or gunners, or tail gunners. It's just fantastic. It's addictive.
Well, that's a wonderful addiction. Camaraderie, a sense of adventure, and a sense of history. All of these things we have people who are volunteering from Sun City have found at the Mighty 8th Museum. You come down and see it. It's a wonderful experience.
1939, the ambitious Germans, the Nazis, decided they wanted to take over the world. And before that, they wanted complete control of everything. And the first place they attacked with their blitzkriegs, which were dive bombers, the Stukas, the Me-109s, Focke-Wulf 190s coming in to attack the civilians like they did in Poland, we knew we were in big trouble. So did the French, so did the English, so did the Danes, so did the Netherlands, because that's where they were going. They blitzkrieged all these places, sent in the ground troops, sent in the panzer divisions, and brother, we were close to having total war in the United States. We were almost in it. But I would like to do something, because being in high school in those years, if you graduated in 1935 to 1942 from high school, you were in World War II, unless you were 4F. I mean, it was just an accident of history. And I can't say it any better than Franklin Roosevelt said, some generations, much is expected of. Some generations, much is given. This generation has a rendezvous with destiny. And that was true, because we're just an accident of history. Same thing with the Civil War, same thing with what's going on now. The whole point is, we were into war because the Germans were very aggressive. When we got into the war, after Pearl Harbor, the Germans occupied all of Eastern Europe, all of Western Europe. They occupied North Africa, Italy, and the Scandinavian countries. I mean, all we had was England. But if you notice this dark brown area, here's France, Germany, and so on, but this is the area that they controlled all the way over to Turkey and all the way over past Czechoslovakia and Poland and so on. Also up in the Scandinavian countries like Norway and Finland, and down, I told you, North Africa and so on. But they control that. The pink areas were neutral. Now, notice Switzerland was neutral, maybe. But Switzerland had all the money stored there by the Nazis. And then, of course, Sweden was, that had to be played. If you got in trouble, Sweden was neutral. If you were flying and days later, you could get in there. Great Britain stood alone. Pink. What a lot of people don't realize, Spain was where the German Air Force got trained. They would send them down there every 6 months, fight for Franco against the communists and so on. And that's where these fighter pilots got trained. By the time we got there, these guys were really aces. I mean, they were tough. But Great Britain, my favorite statesman was Winston Churchill for the whole 20th century. And Winston Churchill decided the only thing they could do, pull the troops out of Dunkirk, get to their island, protect it, and that's what they did until we got into the war.
You know, prior to World War II, this country was about 50% were against world getting involved in a war. So it was the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor that got us involved in the war. And this country just changed like in an instant. Everybody wanted to have something to do with the war effort. So again, unfortunately, when we got attacked, we, of course, had to defend ourselves against the Japanese. And almost immediately, Germany declared war on us. We didn't declare war on them. They declared war on us. So almost within 24 hours, they say World War II, but actually we were involved in 2 wars. One in the South Pacific and one in Europe. And we were not prepared for that. But I will say in defense of our military, we got we got ready very, very fast. Now, as a combat veteran, I can remember the saying in the beginning of the war. When we get in the beginning of the war, we were not prepared, but when we got over there, we thought that the B-17 was impregnable, that nobody would dare attack a B-17 with all of its firepower. They didn't think that the Germans had an aircraft who could fly as high as we could. They thought that the Germans didn't have an anti-aircraft gun that could reach our altitude. So we could fly with a B-17 knowing that we would not be exposed to combat. Well, our first exposure to combat proved us completely wrong. We didn't have a fighter plane that could follow us into the target and all the way back. And the saying early in the war was we were escorted into the target and back. We were escorted by our friendly fighters across the English Channel. And then the German fighters escorted us to the target and back. So it was really early in the war. It was like sending kids that knew that there was hardly any chance of surviving. Now, many of you may not know this name, Limburg. That's a German name, but he was the first one that flew across the Atlantic Ocean solo. And I can remember, again, growing up, I grew up through all this, seeing or hearing or noting that many tried to fly across the Atlantic solo, and when they took off, they disappeared. They were never seen again. Now, about every 15 seconds, a plane crosses over the Atlantic. So Limburg was invited by the Germans to come over and look at their productions, and he was completely surprised by how advanced the Germans were. They were very, very much ahead of us in developing planes, developing rockets, developing we were just behind them. And so when he came over and told our military what he found, they felt that Limburg was in favor of the Nazis. He wasn't. He just wanted to let us know how far behind we were to the Germans. My name is Bud Porter, and I'm a veteran of the 8th Air Force in World War II, and I was a ball turret gunner. I was trained as a radio operator. And when they sent me down to MacDill Field to become a member of a crew, they were naming crews by numbers. And I'll never forget our number, 699. And they named the pilot, the co-pilot, the bombardier, the navigator, and the next position was radio operator. And they didn't name me, and I thought, well, that's not my crew. And the very next position was ball turret, and they said ball turret Porter. Now we're meeting each other for the first time, and I said to the pilot, I'm not going to be here long because there's a mistake. I'm a radio operator. And he looked at me and asked, Porter, how tall are you? And I said, 5'6". He said, I don't know a doggone thing about a ball turret, but he says, that sounds just about right. So that's how I became a ball turret gunner. Now this display here is about the prisoner of war camp. This is a personal observation. This is the worst thing that can possibly happen, could have happened to Bud Porter. I can't imagine being a prisoner of war with the food was terrible. If you got any food at all, it was terrible. and there was very little to do. You had nothing to do unless you could find something amusing with a group of people. But anyway, what I want to emphasize is this is a terrible way to end up.
We're in a safe house. And this safe house is a replica of an actual house that was built in France. One of the young ladies at that time, these gals were, you know, teenagers and better, but they were the only ones around in the farmhouse. And every time you went on a mission, you'd have to fly over occupied Holland, Belgium, and then later on France and so on. It just happens that the lady that owned this house was here when we had the opening. And she probably is in her 80s now, maybe a little older. But she actually saved about 300 British and American flyers. And I'm going to tell you what could happen to you when you took off on a mission. Number one, you could get back alive. That was good. Number two, you could get killed. Number three, you could crash land in enemy territory, or you could bail out. And there were a lot less pilots that got out of B-17s and B-24s than the crew. And the reason was the crew were near like the waist gunners and so on, and the hatches in the airplane. We wore backpacks, and we had a problem because the only way I could get out would be through the bomb bay. And we had flak suits, we had helmets, it would be very hard to bail out. The other two things that could happen to you, you could get to be a POW. The problem was the German youth were vicious. They were trained by Hitler and his thugs, and they would kill you in an instant. The civilians were a great danger to one of our, because you just bombed their town, their city, they're not going to be nice to you. So the best thing that could happen to you is you wind up in a safe house like this. The other thing that could happen to you would be to get to be a prisoner of war, a POW. And the Luftwaffe still had a little bit of esprit de corps from World War I, when they used to throw flyers down on Baron von Richthofen, or when guys like Eddie Rickenbacker in World War I, there was sort of a camaraderie about being a pilot or a flyer and so on. They at least get you into a prison camp. So that was the trick. The intelligence officers, when they briefed us, used to say, stay out of the hands of the German youth. Watch the civilians. Over me, right up here, over on the top, is a secret room. And that secret room was where the airmen would hide, be it British or the 8th Air Force or whatever, 9th Air Force. They could hide up there from the stormtroopers when they came looking for them, because they knew they were somewhere. Under here's a radio in the fireplace, and they tried to make this look like a normal living place. These people in the underground, this lady saved 300 flyers. The people in the underground were great. Most of them got killed. We had a member of the Dutch underground that used to be a member of the 8th Air Force Historical Society here, Leo Werry. He was 15 years old and he posed as a pharmacist. And he was instrumental in saving many flyers. Their lives weren't worth a plug nickel if they got caught. One lady in southern France took part when she was a teenager in saving 3,000 Jewish people and flyers. And not many people know this, but Chuck Yeager, the great pilot who broke the sound barrier and so on. Chuck was flying a P-51, and he was able to get out through the underground over the Pyrenees. And that happened to a lot of guys. Bottom line is 26,000, 8th Air Force, 9th Air Force, and were saved by the underground. 28,000 were killed. So this safe house is really all about escape and evasion.
This room is a room that gets to me. It gets to me. I can hardly talk about this room without creating some tears of my own, because it reminds me, constantly reminds me of all the kids we lost. To be in the Air Force, you had to be from anywhere from 18 to 26. This is the 8th Air Force cemetery outside of Cambridge, England. And under these crosses are, I like to say, kids. There could be some older people, but anywhere from 18 years old to 26. Now here's, this room represents those kids that didn't make it back. And it really, as being a survivor, as I am, it reminds me of how lucky I am. St. James in London has a record of every 8th Air Force person that was killed in World War II. Every page has names of those who didn't make it. Now, every day they have somebody that comes in the morning and turns the page.
Bud and I have been here since the inception of the museum. We welcome you from Sun City here at the museum, and as we welcome everyone. Bud, what do you remember about 1939? Can you remember that much?
Oh, yes. Well, let me put it this way. I've been involved with the museum when they first started to talk about it. They hadn't even put a shovel full of dirt in. So I've been involved in, I guess, sort of a little office on Route 80.
Yep.
When they were just talking about this museum. So this is a result of, let's say, in my about 20 years I've been involved in first talking about the museum, and then with Paul helping them to develop the museum.
The museum also contains the Roger A. Freeman 8th Air Force Research Center, which is dedicated to preserving the legacy of the 8th Air Force and expanding its priceless collection of over 9,000 books, original manuscripts, photographs, oral history interviews, personal accounts, artifacts, and works of art. The memorial gardens behind the museum are a quiet testament to the cherished memorials of the veterans. Stone walls and granite monuments with the names of those who served their country in various campaigns line the winding paths around the reflecting pool. Each has been designed and funded by the 8th veterans and their families. There is a lovely children's garden located here as well. Finally, there is the Chapel of Fallen Eagles, designed to replicate a 16th century old English village church that presides over the gardens, with a carillon that echoes a stream of familiar hymns and melodies to visitors and passers-by. We invite Sun City residents to visit and support the National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force. It's an extraordinary journey into the history of our nation's greatest generation. I'm Arnold Rosen. Thanks for watching.
The National Museum of the Mighty 8th Air Force is located in Pooler, Georgia, just off I-95 at exit 102. The museum is open year-round, daily, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. For visitor information, log on to www.mighty8th.org or call 912-748-8888.